Nothing terrifies political leaders more than inflation. It was rising prices under the Biden presidency that gave Donald Trump back his keys to the White House. And now his own tariffs look likely to hike inflation. Again, Trump is lashing out. In response to Walmart saying they'd have to hike prices in response to tariffs, the president has posted this. Walmart should stop trying to blame tariffs as the reason for raising prices throughout the chain. Walmart made billions of dollars last year, far more than expected. Between Walmart and China, they should, as is said, eat the tariffs and not charge valued customers anything. I'll be watching, and so will your customers. Whether Walmart will eat the tariffs is yet to be seen. Inflation is currently only 2.3% in the United States, the lowest since early 2021. So this inflation, which Donald Trump is clearly terrified of, hasn't quite arrived yet. The UK, though, hasn't been so lucky, driven by hikes in gas, electricity and water bills. Inflation here has just hit 3.5%. Now, that's the highest it's been in more than a year. So what is the future of inflation across the West? Will the cost of living crisis abate or intensify? And how many more governments will be felled by the scourge of rising prices? Someone well placed to answer that question is Mark Blyth, who has co-written a new book called Inflation, A Guide for Users and Losers. Mark is Professor of International Economics at Brown University. We covered so much in this interview, including whether Trump's tariffs had a point, why the UK government is failing so badly on so many fronts, and whether the West is cooked compared to China. But I started by asking him why politicians are so obsessed with the inflation rate.
I think part of it's a kind of muscle memory from university. They all did an econ course at one point and were told that the 70s was literally hell on earth. And if you replicate the 70s and unions get uppity and you'll have wage price spirals and it's all death, none of which actually has anything to do with the inflations that we're getting at the moment, which are all supply shock driven. The real reason they hurt is because at its simplest, inflation is a tax on consumption. And when you have generated extraordinarily unequal societies, what it means is your bottom 60% doesn't have very much money. Therefore, when inflation goes up by, let's say, 5%, if you're spending 60, 70% of your income on consumption goods, that's a real hit. And it's a real hit to millions of people. Conversely, if you're at the other end of the income distribution and you've bought your own house, you've got shares, for example, you don't worry about inflation at all, not just because that share of your consumption is much smaller, but because you can actually benefit from inflationary forces. For example, if you own oil stocks when there's an oil shock. So it's this asymmetry across the income distribution that means that so many people get hurt disproportionately that politicians really fear it.
Is there also an upside to inflation, though? So we'll talk about the UK in a moment, but I know we've got inflation of 3.5%. That was higher than people expected. But actually, wage growth is 5%, which, I mean, should mean that on average, people's wages are rising. And my understanding was also that sort of one of the big groups that get hit by inflation are creditors, so people who've given out loans. So I thought there was also sort of an argument that sort of high inflation, so long as it comes with increased wages, is actually better for people at the lower end of the wage spectrum. I mean, is there something to that?
There is something to that. I mean, it depends on how bad the income skew is, right? If you're basically on 25,000 quid and you live in a major city and you're spending 70% of your income on consumption goods, namely food, fuel, housing, etc., you don't have much. So a little bit more can send you over the edge. Second thing is the debt thing. It's called the Fisher channel, right? Why does this work? Well, ultimately because, if your wages go up and it's higher than the rate of inflation, you're obviously winning. But also if you've got fixed rate debt, then your nominal amount goes up, but ultimately the real value of what you're paying is paying back because inflation's eating away at it. This is why baby boomers all have huge houses, right? They got like that payoff in the 70s. The economy is structured much differently now. Most loans are variable rates, you can adjust them, etc. Banks are really good at not eating the costs of this. So, for example, during the inflationary period of the past couple of years, no one's savings rate on their savings account went up anywhere near the underlying rate of inflation. So the pass-through that you would get from higher interest rates doesn't work. So overall, it's net regressive, even if there are kind of like Fisher channel effects, which leads to this kind of cheapening of debt.
Let's talk about the UK inflation rate. I mean, it's higher here than it is in the rest of Europe or in the United States. As I said earlier, 3.5%. What explains that? I know sort of the headline is that this is because we've got higher bills than we had before, but Why have we got higher bills than Europe or the United States? What explains what's special about us Brits?
It's a British thing. You reset them all at once. And basically, your water bill jumps up at a certain time of year, your gas bill jumps up at a certain time, and they all hit at once. So it's a kind of classic sort of, you're getting this one-time shock. Does that lead to higher inflation structurally, or does it dissipate? Open question. Is inflation at 3.5% really that high? Only if you think that 2% was normal. And if you look at over a longer period of history, 2% would have been something that they would have dreamed of having in the 60s or the 1970s. We had this extraordinary period of basically from the late 90s through until the financial crisis. And then from the financial crisis onward of negative real rates and deflation rather than inflation. So we got used to this period of incredibly low rates. Given the fact that the inflations that caused the forces that caused the inflationary problems of the past couple of years are largely supply shocks stemming from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and then companies taking advantage of this in concentrated markets. Is it really that much of a shock that it's 3.5%? It's not.
So should we just get used to that? Is that sort of your argument, that sort of if we get used to 3.5% instead of 2%, then we should just be able to get used to this as they did in the 60s?
Right, but in the 60s you had a much more equalitarian income distribution. So basically, you had less people at the bottom end of the tail that were susceptible to having a really nasty inflation shock. The costs of it were actually much less. You had concentrated interest in the middle. You had unions that basically could bargain for their share of productivity. None of that stuff applies now, which was why I find looking at the labour market for inflationary forces in Britain, where you've got part-time contracting, a large gig economy, nobody's in a union, the notion that wages are going to rise faster than prices. The only reason you've got 6% on wage increase for a couple of years was because prior to that, they were stagnant for forever. It's not even close to catching up where it would be if you just not followed out the trend. It's yes, get used to it, but that's going to be hard for large segments of the population. Second thing is, if you think about the long-term drivers of this stuff, geopolitical stuff, let's say decoupling from economies, tariffs, etc. All of these things are kind of policy-induced supply shocks. And if you think about tariffs in particular in the US, it's designed to raise prices. That's what it does. No matter the fudge on this, you want things to be more expensive so that firms come home to manufacture there because it's cheaper to do that. Higher prices are written into the script.
I understand that. I understand why tariffs would lead to higher prices. I suppose, is it surprising that still hasn't been sort of borne out in the inflation figures? Because I think inflation is still lower in the United States than it's been for quite a while. So I think some people were expecting as soon as those tariffs come into effect, then you would see a spike in inflation. But that hasn't happened yet. Is it just that we sort of haven't waited long enough for this to filter through to consumers?
You got to wait till you run out of stuff. I mean, once you start seeing shortages because 1/3 of the traffic that usually comes from China didn't show up, and now everyone's trying to restock with reduced inventories, just give it time, it will filter through. Is it going to be huge? That's probably not going to be huge. I mean, in 2016, when Trump came in the first time and put up tariffs, loads of people were saying, it was going to be huge inflation from tariffs. And there really wasn't, because the exchange rate of the people who are sending you this stuff and also the profit margins of those firms, they can take a hit, they can accommodate, they still want to be in the market. And when it was the crazy tariffs of April 2nd, what set the markets off was nobody's going to be able to absorb this. Now you've got 30% on China and 10% on the rest of the world. You can absorb that more, but is that where it stays? This whole thing's very quixotic. We don't know where it's going to go.
You sort of talked about geopolitical shifts there. As far as I understand it, China doesn't have high inflation. If anything, they've got a bit of a deflationary economy. It seems to be principally the West where we landed with sort of stagnant growth, stagnant wages, and also in inflation. I mean, is the West cooked, for want of a better word?
Well, they do have structurally low growth, and part of the reason for this is the way that we adapted to sort of the 70s was through globalization. And particularly for Europe as a whole, not so much the United Kingdom, which actually tends to have slightly higher growth, is the fact that they've started since 2012 being an net exporter against the rest of the world. If you're a net exporter, what do you want? You want to have a relatively cheap currency. You want to suppress consumption at home. You don't want people going out and partying and having real wage increases. You want to have it slow and steady, and that way your exports maintain their price competitiveness. So it's kind of written into the script. That's the downside for the export economies. For countries like the United Kingdom, on the other side, to a certain extent, our bonanza was unlimited exports without having an exchange rate crisis. And it seems that the Americans have decided that the cost of that, which is hollowing out large parts of your economy, is not worth paying, and that we're going to turn against that. But the cost of turning against that is going to be higher prices, so coming from these shocks. So, maybe that system that we got used to is not going to be around much longer.
What should the UK government be doing?
A hell of a lot more than it is now across every bloody sector I can think of. They seem to be absolutely terrified of doing anything and completely in the thrall of whatever the Bank of England and the Treasury tell them. The job of the Treasury is not to spend any money, and the job of the Bank of England is to tell the Treasury why they can't spend any money. So if you don't actually have a Labour Party that's willing to say, hey, lads, we're going to do something different and stick to it, you get what you've got just now. So, where do you want to start with what they should be doing? For me, start with taking the Town and County Planning Act of 1946, binning it, starting again and start building 100 to 150,000 houses a year. Do that through local authorities, keep it on the state's balance sheet. You borrow at 4%, you make 5% on the house, you're making 1% net. That 1% net means you've got an asset. That asset stays on the government's books and becomes an asset that reduces the overall stock of debt. If you do housing, you have to do skills. You could reinvigorate the tech colleges that have been allowed to atrophy. You need HVAC people, you need plumbers, you need sparkies, the whole lot, all of which are actually great jobs for green industries going forward. Once you do housing, you do labour mobility. Once you do labour mobility, you get away from the London bubble. You can actually invest in other areas. There's so much that could be done, and it's so simple. And they just seem absolutely terrified of opening up the biscuit tin and spending any money.
That's really interesting. And so you think that should be done by borrowing more instead of tax rises on the wealthy? Or sort of what's your take on that? I suppose if they're building a house, they get an asset at the end of it, so they can say it is, yes, we have borrowed a load of money, but we've got this asset at the end of it, a bit like when you sort of buy a house with a mortgage. What's your take? Are you saying they should borrow more to do this?
I'm saying if they need to borrow and they have a coherent borrowing plan, then given the fact that the American bond market has been severely impacted by Trump's behavior, as you can see in the yields, sterling acts as a safe asset alternative. If you've got a credible plan for why you're doing this, why it's going to lead to growth, all bond markets care about is they want to know they're going to get paid back. If you have a credible story about how they're going to get paid back, they'll allow you room to borrow. It's really that simple. And the government is scared of its own shadow and has taken exactly the long lessons from the Liz Truss episode, which is that if you do anything, the bond market will freak out. And that's simply not the case. Also, if you want to tax the wealthy as well, and you can do that without them moving their assets abroad, do that too. But at the end of the day, we're doing this to build assets. It's totally different than doing it for consumption.
Yeah, so you're borrowing for your capital spend. So presumably she'd end up having to break her fiscal rules. No one can work out why she doesn't want to do that. I suppose you've just explained it because they've taken the wrong lesson from Liz Truss, and I suppose they want support from the wrong people. At the moment, we have, maybe a plan like yours could resolve it, but at the moment we have low growth. Most of Europe has low growth, and it seems to be breaking politics. I know you edited a book called Diminishing Returns, The New Politics of Growth and Stagnation, a couple of years ago in 2022, in fact. Could you talk about that? Are our liberal democracies not really suited to function properly in an era of very low growth?
That's a great question. To a certain extent, yes, because why do you care about growth? You care about growth because unless your population is shrinking, you will have less stuff per person. That's really why it is. So at the end of the day, can you degrow as many people would like to do in terms of the climate? Well, you can, but you have to sell them being poorer. And that's a really, really tough one to do. So why do we like growth? Because it basically allows us the kind of movement that you can have inequalities so long as everybody's moving up, then it's relative shifts. Once you don't have growth, that becomes a real problem and it becomes sort of my assets against yours or lack thereof. So why have we got low growth? It's actually a lot of it solvable by policy. Some of it's demography. We just didn't have enough kids and therefore your labor force is shrinking. But if you weren't toxic about immigration, you can solve it that way, right? And that's in large part what we have been doing. Spain is the fastest growing economy in Europe, and basically it's all down to immigration. What else can you do? You could actually have sensible state and also private sector investment, not public-private partnership bollocks or handing over Thames Water to a bunch of Aussies to asset strip it, but actual things, as I was talking there about housing and using local authority budgets and balance sheets in order to do this. You could reinvigorate your training college sector, so on and so forth. There's so many things you could do. On the macro side, you've got a problem, which is that since 2012, the Eurozone as a whole has basically tried to run an export surplus against the rest of the world. As we said, that means lower consumption in those countries, and that lower consumption in the aggregate leads to lower growth. Where do you get high consumption? In the consumption-led economies, and that's the United Kingdom, that's the United States, etc. Why? Because they're getting real stuff, and they're paying for it with digital certificates that bear the rate of inflation. So they're on the good side of that trade, except the problem with that is over the long term, you don't make anything. And then you basically say, oops, lads, we've completely deindustrialized. That might not be a good thing. Let's do something about it. So this has been a long time in the making. It's a story about imbalances, and it's a story about particular growth models that rely on consumption suppression for low growth.
What should the UK make? I know you've sort of said, and I think very persuasively said, we should be investing loads in housing. That seems like a no-brainer. But presumably in terms of these trade imbalances, we need to be producing something that we can sell to other people as well, so sort of export markets. What should Britain be producing that it's not? And I suppose, how could you have a government stimulate that?
If you think about the US as an example here, what was it that Biden tried to do with the Inflation Reduction Act? It was to get ahead in green sectors. Now, that boat's probably sailed given the fact that China's got a complete dominance in this. But what are the other things that Britain's actually good at? Britain's actually really good at... Britain exports a hell of a lot of high-end services, right? You don't want to kill that. Not everything has to be made in a factory by blokes, right? That's a very 50s imaginary on this sort of stuff. What could we make? We could make a heck of a lot of, for example, renewable power stuff. What else could we make? We're pretty good at a whole bunch of things like photovoltaics and others that not necessarily making the panels, but the science behind it. We've got a pharma hub. There's a whole bunch of stuff that are like sectors that you could invest in, don't even need actually government investment in this. Where the government helps is basically by improving infrastructure. The infrastructure has been allowed to decay to a terrible extent. And ultimately, that's one of your main productivity drivers. So the job for government for me isn't to pick sectors in the UK. It's basically to upskill the population in relevant skills, not send everybody to a university to have a politics degree. He says, being somebody who manufactures people who have politics degrees. But nonetheless, do that and basically build out the infrastructure that the country's sorely lacking.
I think the people who've made the argument about universities in the UK at the moment, it's sort of the blue Labour wing of the Labour Party. I can't remember precisely who it was. Might have been Dan Carden, actually, who's a Labour MP, suggested that what we should do is reduce the number of people going to do academic courses at universities and basically revert some of the new universities back into technical colleges or polytechnics. Is that something you'd support?
It's a question of what do you want to do when you grow up, right? So do you want to actually have a job in the service sector that pays 30,000 quid? Because if you do, your gateway for that is to take on $9,000 of debt a year and get an undergraduate degree in whatever subject it is. If, on the other hand, you basically want to do something in the green economy, yeah, you're definitely going to need people who know Excel and can run a survey, but you actually need a lot more electricians than we're producing because a lot of that was done by the unions and they've all collapsed. And we don't have a proper apprenticeship system. So if you really want to be serious about a green economy, it's the biggest energy retrofit in human history. You're going to need certain skills, and we just don't train people to do this stuff. So that strikes me as an eminently reasonable proposition.
On climate change, I know one of the arguments you make in your book, you recently made it in a Guardian article as well, is that one of the inflationary risks on the horizon that we're not taking seriously enough is climate change. I suppose, first of all, could you just sort of cash out that idea? Why might climate change increase inflation in the future?
When was the last time it rained in the UK? I'm sitting in Cambridge right now. It's 2 months ago. Right, so you're going to have a drought. What happens when you have persistent droughts? Your crop yields start to go down. When your crop yields start to go out, you either have to import more, and you will have to import more, and or prices go up. So some of this is just incredibly simple, right? There's more complex, more subtle effects. The one that I pay particular attention to is insurance markets. So I'll give you an example from the US. I don't know if it works quite the same way in the UK, but I'd be surprised if it didn't. You can't get a mortgage without insurance on the house. And if you live in Florida, there's now only 4 insurers will write policies, and they're twice as expensive as everywhere else. And as the number of multi-billion-dollar wildfires and other things go up year by year, the reinsurance market, the guys who insure the insurers, they basically start saying, we can't afford this anymore. So if the insurance companies can't insure themselves, they withdraw coverage. Roll all this back, what does it mean? It means less houses getting built. It means the only people who can do it are pretty rich people who don't need the mortgage. Run through the knock-on effects on that and what it means for properties, for rentals, for the costs of rentals, right? So you can see how these effects would percolate out. then what climate change is essentially a sort of supply shock generator that as things get warmer, you will have more and more of these shocks. And that needs to be something that every government's thinking about.
I suppose, again, bringing this back to China. So China has basically zero inflation. They're also facing the same sort of climate change challenges the rest of the world are. Why, if it was climate change that's sort of behind some of this, would it be particularly impacting some countries and not others? I suppose, is it the case that sort of Europe and North America is more vulnerable to climate shocks than China, or they're better at managing them?
Could just be that the Chinese are lying about their inflation statistics because they lie about most of them. So I wouldn't take that one off the table. No, structurally, again, basically, their exports to GDP peaked in 2008 at 40%. But their economy's more than doubled since 2008, which means that even though their exports to GDP has gone down, the volume has actually increased. They are incredible in the volume of stuff they can do, which is why they've got EVs and green supply chains, all this sort of stuff. And what does that mean? It means it's actually exporting deflation to the rest of the world. So on one side, if you're worried about inflation, just take a bunch of Chinese imports and that'll help. But then your ability to produce this stuff goes down, and then that creates its own problems. So why are some countries more susceptible to inflation? Partly because if you're China, you can tightly control things that you can't in these other countries. And secondly, because we're just big importers. So we're at the mercy of everybody else's cost structures. Whereas if you're an exporter, you're structurally biased towards deflation, you'll like it, and you consume less. If it's a tax on consumption, it's less effect.
I mean, imagine you're not a fan of the way Trump has done his tariffs, but you sound, in the way you're talking there, quite sympathetic to the idea that countries like the UK and the United States running sort of permanent trade deficits isn't a great idea. So do you think that Trump had some logic when it came to the tariffs?
I don't know if Trump had some logic, but I mean, I think that Michael Pettis, who makes the strongest version of this argument, the most sophisticated version of it, makes a lot of sense. On a gross basis, like trade is absolutely huge and bilateral trade between these two countries doesn't matter. But just go read all the papers on the China shock and you instantly understand where MAGA came from, right? Brexit, where does Brexit come from? It comes from all the people that were subject to the bedroom tax, welfare reform, and import shocks from China, right? So there's an imbalances problem. If you consistently import stuff, you don't make it. And it's not just that you don't make it, you lose the skills to make it because you haven't done it in 20 years. Are these problems? Yes. And in fact, the Democrats were the first ones to address it. They kept up all of Trump's tariffs and they tried to do reindustrialization on green basis through the IRA. Trump is basically just taking that to the next level, killing the developmental state arc side of this, killing the training side of this because they hate the universities, and putting all on tariffs. Do I think it will work if you do that? Absolutely not. But both of these governments saw this as a problem, right? There's nothing new in this. It's just that we're beginning to wake up to the fact that running permanent imbalances is really, really problematic.
I suppose I just want to cash this out because we've had other guests saying quite different things in the recent past, especially, I suppose, when Trump was first starting this latest round of the trade war with China, and he was sort of saying, China has exploited us, they've undercut our workers. And we had people on saying that's actually a misstatement of what happened. We've benefited from cheaper goods from China and tech. You sort of do think that our openness potentially to the Chinese economy has done a considerable amount of damage to our economies?
Yeah, it has. I mean, there's tons of academic work on this. But, is it the case that they're ripping us off, right? No, bullshit. What you're doing is very straightforward. You're engaging in voluntary transactions with someone who's a lower cost producer. Your companies, your American companies, went to China to take advantage of two things: comparative advantage in environmental despoilation and regulation, really good infrastructure and cheap labor. And 40% of Chinese exports are still multinationals selling back. So the notion that we are being ripped off by them, that's complete horseshit. But are the net effects of permanent imbalances something to worry about? I think that you do have to worry about that, because ultimately any import you're taking in has to, in some sense, be paid by a real export going the other way eventually. Otherwise, you're just writing IOUs. When do the IOUs become due? What happens if you don't actually make anything that they want? So imagine a world 15 years from now, you've hit peak oil, rest of the world's gone EV, America's behind tariffs, it's doubled down on its carbon economy, and it's making giant trucks at huge expense running on gasoline. Who the wants that? Nobody, right? So this stuff matters on some level.
So I suppose you were more in favor potentially of the kind of Biden type tariffs, which was to put tariffs on China to allow America to build up its own domestic manufacturing sectors. I suppose in particular he had a focus on green industry. So is that the kind of tariff policy that you think is sensible?
I would actually just rather the countries like Germany and China just exported less and consumed more of their own stuff at home, paid their workers more wages, which would mean that other people would be able to sell more stuff to them, and the system would rebalance without any of this nonsense to do with tariffs. But if tariffs is the only way that you can do this, which I'm not convinced it is, then I guess there's a rationale for it. Ultimately, end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I think this is really true or not. What really matters is the fact that it seems to be the case across two administrations. The people in power think it's true, and that's the direction of travel. So debating the finer points of it, I think, is kind of pointless because that's actually where we're going. And this seems to be driving it, and it's going to continue to drive it.
Yeah, and you think it's going to continue because I suppose there is one analysis that Trump has sort of applied these tariffs in such a cack-handed manner. They seem to be deeply unpopular. That this might have, in a way, delegitimized tariffs. So maybe if he'd done it competently, then we would have entered a new era where sort of globalization was just a thing of the past, or the kind of globalization we've had was a thing of the past. But some people are saying because he's messed this up so badly, it could have a kind of Liz Truss type effect of delegitimizing a way of doing economic policy and actually, I suppose, reinvigorate support for globalization. I think you have seen in some polls that now Democrats suddenly think free trade is great. So I'm getting from you, though, that you think sort of this increase in trade barriers is here to stay.
I think it's here to stay. And then the question is, how do you enforce it if it becomes unpopular? And this is the whole question about, well, we'll defeat him in the midterms. Are you going to have midterms? Let's find out where this is going, right? So there's a big risk here that we overestimate, the capacity for the Trump administration to, in a sense, be corrigible to error. They might just blast through this, ignore courts, ignore public sentiment, et cetera, manipulate elections, whatever. Who knows where this goes? It can go to any direction. Do I think that there's a way you should have done this if you're going to do it? Yeah. If you want to change a growth model of a country, there's pretty much a formula for it, which was known since basically the 1870s with the rise of Germany. You basically need a developmental state, you need captive finance, or at least cooperative finance. You need an equalitarian income distribution of sorts. And you need a competent state that's going to execute it, right? You need all that. And then you do tariffs. If all you got are tariffs, forget it. It's not going to work.
You talked about the potentially inflationary effect of climate change. There are lots of people who argue that there's another phenomenon on the horizon that could be deflationary, artificial intelligence. So the argument is that if this replaces loads and loads of jobs, especially in the service sector, then that would presumably bring down costs because it's cheaper to employ an artificial intelligent agent or an artificially intelligent agent than it is an actual sort of living, breathing human. So could AI in the near future sort of massively bring down prices in certain sectors, and could that have an overall deflationary effect?
It could do if the hype around it is true. But the thing about, I'm old. The thing about old is, you've seen it before. I remember when this was called big data. That was 15 years ago. There was a book produced in 2010 by a couple of guys at Harvard Business School, I think it was, or the Kennedy School, The Race Against the Machine. It said that 60% of all jobs are going to be automated by 2016, 2020. Then there was an Oxford Business School, Saïd Business School study that said, no, lads, you got that wrong, it's only 40%. Then the OECD went down to 20%. And we got to 2020 and none of it happened. So, I've seen hype bubbles before. I'm still waiting for the blockchain revolution. I've noted many times that every time we've had a major technological shift, labour markets have transformed and gotten bigger, not smaller, because it all rests upon a lump of labour fallacy. There's a certain amount of work to be done, and if the robots do it, we don't do it. So just colour me skeptic on that entire thing. I think what's happening, here's an interesting one if you want to ever think about this. Why is it the Trump administration is going after the universities, right? Well, anti-Semitism, et cetera. No, why do they want to punish us? Because we're the liberal elite. All right. Here's another one. How about all the tech barons are massively overinvested in AI and are going to make huge losses because they can't even define the short-term end use for it. And they're never going to find 20% extra electricity to run these things. So it's a bit of a bust. Wouldn't it be nice if you could get $500 billion a year in guaranteed funding that used to go to the top research universities to cover your losses? Just saying.
So you think the reason he's defunding the universities is specifically so that frees up money as a bung to go into Google or OpenAI to, I suppose, fund their data centers.
Why wouldn't they want that? Why are you giving Harvard all this money? You should give it to us. Haven't you heard the narrative? Nothing happens in universities. Everything happens in tinkerers. Nobody would have invented the internet in a university, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Of course.
I completely take your point that sort of there have been plenty of hype bubbles before that haven't been completely borne out. I suppose arguments as to why AI might be different is because this is the first time where you've had a technology which is really self-reinforcing. So the people who seem very excited about an AI sort of intelligence explosion, what they're saying is that AI is now able to improve its own code. So you've got a machine which is bettering itself without real human participation, which seems somewhat new. And then I suppose in terms of the practical sense of seeing this being borne out in sort of real world decisions, my understanding is that the AI companies have really slowed down in terms of hiring junior coders, because basically the senior coders don't need any junior support anymore because they can just get the AI to do it all. So, I mean, do you take seriously any of the arguments that AI could be different to these different phases, and that this really could be a dramatically sort of more revolutionary technology, which really could destroy a lot more jobs than the internet or blockchain ever did?
No. And here's why. Fastest growing job in the United States by volume for the past 15 years is elder care nurse. It dwarfs software engineers and everything to do with that industry by a factor of 12. We're all getting older. There's no robot for lifting you in and out of bed, and it's not an AI problem to solve. Second one is this. The reason you get very, very shitty, slow S-curves in technology adoption, it's not because of the technology. So I'll give you an example of this. LiDAR. LiDAR works beautifully, right? And Waymo's test driving in California is way safer than anything that humans do. So why aren't we all doing it? Because you're going to have to write a piece of code into the software for this thing that says, in the event of running into a bus of children or a bus of nuns, always take out the nuns. And the minute you do that, you're legally liable to the Catholic Church and they will sue you. Now, why is it that I think it was Altman a couple of years ago said that when AI comes online, cancer detection is going to go so much better because the AI never gets tired, it's better at recognizing patterns, all the rest of it. Why is it that no screeners have been fired while they've been augmented with AI? No, it's simply because of liability. At the end of the day, do you want your cancer test done by a robot or a human?
I think quite possibly in the near future, I would want it done by AI. I mean, if the evidence was showing me that AI did it better, I imagine I'd be, perfectly happy with that to some degree. I mean, couldn't you have said the same thing about like when lifts were automated, that people might have preferred it when a human was controlling it instead of like the button, but then we still ended up having automated lifts?
There's nothing at risk in a lift button. There's a risk in your prostate diagnosis. And if the machine gets it wrong, who do you blame? I'm simply saying that there are frictions in the real world that make the easy technology adoption and instant transformation, particularly when you don't have a good business case for most of the stuff that they've got, beyond cheating in academic essays. Not sure what it's for.
Lots of people cheating in your academic essays.
Oh, loads. Oh, my God. Actually, it's not so bad where I am, but the horror stories of colleagues, different places, amazing.
If you enjoyed hearing from Mark Blyth, well, we want to bring you more interviews like that. Big thinkers really grappling with the hard questions. At Novara Media, we're committed to challenging the low information slop the mainstream media churns out. Instead, we want to bring you rich, nutritious, fact-based analysis. If you want to see more of that, then please support Novara Media from as little as 1 hour's wage per month, or even less. I mean, for as little as £1 a month. Whatever you can afford, you can sign up at www.novaramedia.com/support. The link is in the description box below. Excellent work takes time and a lot of effort, and we can't do it without you.